infura. What happens if it fails? Like what are the different things that can go wrong with it? You know, a lot of stuff, and people talk about metamask using it, things like that. How would we even know if, you know, such a network did fail?
Well, I think Long Vacation can go into more depth, but if it fails, sure, and some other node services fail along with it, if there's any like fallbacks, like your wallets just won't work. You'll try and use a MetaMask or whatever, and like nothing will happen. It won't talk to the chain you're trying to access. So it's interesting. And he'll go into a little more depth, but we say all this stuff is decentralized, right? But you have to have these interfaces like MetaMask that speak to the chain. And those are through things like infura nodes. If those fail, and if they're centrally hosted or whatever, and somebody just pulls the plug on them, or the government says, we hate crypto, turn it off, right? We're SOL. And we won't be able to access their stuff. And there's some workarounds, right? There's some decentralized nodes, I'm sure. But yeah, we could still all get effed.
Either one of you go into too, like why does MetaMask even use infura? Like why is it required? Why can't we just use purely decentralized systems?
Well, I think MetaMask was built by, or is owned by the same group that runs infura, right? So Consensus, I believe, runs all of that. Infura is also the de facto standard in the industry. They've created several APIs that are kind of like the corner, used everywhere for accessing data on the blockchain, on IPFS, on running transactions on Ethereum, and so on. So they are not the only node service provider. There are several other node service providers out there. So and they're not cheap by any means, but they are kind of the standard for Ethereum, and they're expanding out to other EVM chains. The challenge is, right, I think we learned last year that Consensus is partially owned by JP Morgan or some of these other centralized banks, right? And there was a question of, okay, if there was pressure put on this one entity to turn off certain wallets, to turn off certain contracts or tokens, whatever, because they control the nodes, they control the access to the data. They could basically say, okay, everybody in this country can no longer access our nodes, and therefore would have to point their services to something else, right?
That's what I wanted to ask too. So when you say turn off someone's wallet, now we know you hold your keys, you have access to your coins, but how does MetaMask, how does your that kind of wallet infura, what can they do as far as turning off your wallet in that way, and sure, how would you get around it?
So, I mean, this is on a macro scale, right? Not pinpointed towards one person. But the idea is anybody who's set up a new RPC code for, say, PulseChain testnet in MetaMask, right? It gives you instructions on how to name the network, the ID for the network, and then there's the the actual endpoint that you're connecting to. That is the node that you're using for your wallet to go read off the blockchain to see, okay, this address holds these things. And it can link then to the block explorer, which will show you your historical transactions and so on. The node is your window into the blockchain data. So you need that. That is our way of reading the database. Without that, we can't get to any of that information. So if that node is turned off, or access to that node is blocked for certain gateways or parts of the country, right, or parts of the world, right? So if they were to say like Iran can no longer access any of our nodes, well, no one in Iran or has access in Iran can now access one of those nodes, and therefore is blocked from doing a lot of things in crypto unless they point to another service, right?
But couldn't they just spin up their own node?
Yes, essentially, you would have to go through the work of doing all of that yourself, right? And then, while nodes can be relatively easy, it's not something every, mom and pop on the block will probably want to or be able to do and maintain. Yeah, that's the other part of Infura is their high speed, high connectivity, redundant, always on, right? Reliable services in huge data centers versus someone who's running a Raspberry Pi device in their basement, and maybe it's updated, maybe it's not, maybe it's never touched, right? So you get different quality of service. Yeah.
It just makes me think of like when they, MetaMask or whoever, Consensus, whoever shut off Venezuela from infura, or that happened a while back. Couldn't they just, the government or anybody there just spin up a few nodes and hey, we're back in business?
But they would have to, and they would have to incur that cost to do so, right? Or find another provider that they can point to, right? And maybe even have to adopt a different wallet software. I mean, who knows, right? It raises all these questions, right? And it goes back to the age-old argument of centralized versus decentralized. How much do you need of both to make these systems work? How decentral can you go on everything, right? And we're still running into practical limits on a lot of these things, right? So while, for example, Hex is completely decentralized, it's trustless, it's immutable, it still relies on these node services for you to be able to access your wallet. It still relies on the miners to be able to process the transactions, right? So, there are certain things that are just inherent in the system that it will take time for us to kind of work these things out, if that's ultimately where you go.